In the spirit of not getting started too late, since it's 2 minutes after 10, why don't we start? I'm Jim Marshall. I'm pleased to welcome all of you here to the Institute of Peace. And we're particularly pleased to have Stuart Bowen and his panel, which includes Manal Omar, one of our great superstars, to talk about a very important subject. I'd say that we, as a country, have learned an awful lot as a result of our engagement in Iraq. I know that an awful lot of the things that the Institute itself learned in Iraq, we are applying elsewhere around the globe. It has helped us, for example, pretty significantly where Libya is concerned and other states that are struggling with transitions. A lot of lessons to be learned. I've got plenty of personal stories. I'm actually quoted in the book and on the back cover. It is important that we learn those lessons and that we don't repeat the mistakes that we made in Iraq. And with that, I'll turn it over to Stuart Bowen. Stuart, glad you're here.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim.
Now, do you want to come up here?
Or,
It's entirely up to you.
I'm happy to do it from here. Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Jim. And thanks to all of you. It's a joy to be here at the U.S. Institute for Peace. This is a beautiful building, the most beautiful one in Washington, I think. Evidence that architecture can lift the soul, and a blessing to all those that get to work here. And as I said to Jim when I was here to interview him 6 weeks ago, you have the best office in Washington. And he said, yes, and I have the best mission in Washington too. And no argument there. This is 30 years has made important contributions, an example of how to take limited resources and really to strategic value to advance our national security interest. And this particular form of interest, that is defending it in stabilization and reconstruction operations, is the nature of the modern era. And indeed, that's the experience of Iraq, the experience in Afghanistan, the experience of the last 30 years, and that's why these lessons are important. I want to also say it's a real pleasure to be on this panel with Bill Taylor, who I got to know in 2004 and 2005. He was the first director of the Iraq Reconstruction Management Office when John Negroponte became the first ambassador in many years to Iraq. And played a crucial role, Bill did, in recognizing the need to move money from large infrastructure into security. Now, that was the challenge. And also a pleasure to be with my friend John Nagel, who has played many important roles in advancing our national security interests, both in the service, in uniform, in the think tank community here in Washington, and now at the Naval Academy as the Minerva Research Professor. So he is truly wise, yeah, no doubt about it. And a pleasure to be here with Manal as well. Thank you. To talk about really what's important of these lessons. A lesson learned that's not a lesson applied. The subject of today's conversation is a lesson lost. And so it's crucial that we not lose these lessons, the lessons from Iraq, the lessons from Afghanistan, like we frankly lost lessons from the Balkans. I remember early on in 2004, talking to some leadership in the Coalition Provisional Authority, said, what lessons from the Balkans are being applied here? And the answer was, this isn't the Balkans. I think that we can't make that same mistake. SIGIR has been around for 9 years now, and we will continue to do our mission through September 30th, investigating crimes that occurred in Iraq. And we produced 390 audits and 9 lessons learned reports. Learning from Iraq, the subject of my remarks today, is our last major report, and it provides 7 important lessons drawn from our collective effort over the last 9 years. We meet today on an auspicious and sobering anniversary. 10 years ago, the statue of Saddam Hussein was pulled down in Firda Square. Not the first time a statue has been pulled down by Iraqis in a square. In 1958, 45 years before, the statue of King Faisal in another revolutionary moment was pulled down. But this was different, obviously. The United States was there, engaging. And so I think I look at the last 10 years really in two 5-year increments. The first 5 I would call from Furta Square to Nasur Square, a very painful and arduous 5 years that saw us go from liberate and leave to occupy and rebuild in the blink of an eye in the spring of 2003 as Orha was displaced by the Coalition Provisional Authority, and to go from $2 billion to $20 billion that year in planned expenditures. And then the following year moving into sovereignty, and then in 2006 into civil war, and in 2007 into the surge, and in 2008, in 2007, Nasur Square, for those of you who don't know the tragedy involving the death of 17 Iraqis in a security detail gone wrong, in a very tragic situation that was somewhat emblematic of what generally was going wrong in Iraq at that time. And then the last 5 years, I would say, from Nasur Square to regular order, shaped by the 2008 Security Agreement, the Strategic Framework Agreement, the struggle with whether troops should stay, the resultant fact that they didn't, and now managing a very large embassy of about 10,000 with a very small assistance program that frankly will shrink to nothing for USAID, for example, in 2014. And the engagement now challenges, the engagement challenges for Ambassador Stephen Beecroft, as he told me 2 weeks ago when I was visiting with him, are steep, simply because the Iraqis were used to us showing up with stuff, as I say. You know, we provided $60 billion worth over 9 years, and now in this 10th year we have little to give, but we have much to ask for, and that's provided some struggle points. So now on to the 7 lessons, really built around Chapter 2. You've got a copy, most of you, of Learning from Iraq, and what's new in this report are the 44 interviews that I conducted, with 17 Iraqi leadership, members of the Iraq government, and including Prime Minister Maliki, Deputy Prime Minister Shahristani, the former Prime Ministers Alawi and Jaffrey, the head of the Central Bank and the President of the Board of Supreme Audit, Bassett, and also with 15 U.S. leaders, including Generals Petraeus, Odierno, Austin, Ambassadors Crocker, Hill, and Jeffrey, and also Secretary Panetta, and Deputy Secretary Burns, and Deputy Secretary Nides. And interestingly and importantly different from our report, Hard Lessons, which came out in 2009, and this is sort of a follow-on to, I focused on Capitol Hill as well, interviewing Senators McCain, McCaskill, Collins, and Chairman McKeon, among others, to get their input. And so their responses, to a great extent, teased out and shaped these lessons, these 7 lessons. And they begin with lesson 1, which is echoing our first lesson from Hard Lessons, because it stands out and is evident in what the Iraqis said, what the leaders said, what Congress said. And that is the need to continue to improve our approach to stabilization and reconstruction operations. That is, to strengthen unity of command and thus unity of effort through such reforms that clarify who is in charge as their primary duty of planning, executing, and overseeing stabilization and reconstruction operations. That's not clear today. Today, we still have a diffusion of responsibilities among the 5 major agencies. At DOD, we saw in 2005 perhaps the most revolutionary doctrinal development in the last 30 years with the establishment, or the signature by Secretary Rumsfeld on DOD Directive 3001.05. Creating stabilization operations as a third aspect of what the Army does. The Army has, since its inception, frankly, carried out offensive and defensive operations. But now, formally and as part of the field manual, stabilization operations are essential to its mission. What that means, how that's realized, still under development at the Pentagon and in practice in the field, but there's something called the CEW, the Civilian Expeditionary Workforce, which is a significant part of it, working within its own stovepipe, to use the apt metaphor, alongside other agencies in Afghanistan and elsewhere. At the State Department, we now have something called the Conflict and Stabilization Office, led by Rick Barton, a great guy who helped me immensely on hard lessons. Couldn't be more qualified for the mission to which he's called. And I spent an hour and a half with his staff last week and got a good sense of what they're doing. They're doing targeted, discrete, limited scale assistance operations in places like Honduras and Syria and Kenya, for example, somewhat similar to what the Office of Transition Initiatives, the other piece in this collection of entities engaged in planning and executing SROs. The Office of Transition Initiatives does similar work for USAID. At the Treasury Department is the Office of Technical Assistance. Effective, successful in what it has sought to carry out, certainly in Iraq and elsewhere, but again, operating within its own parochial setting. And at the Justice Department, something called ICITAP, which is sort of tactical capacity building for the judiciary and ministries of justice around the world in stabilization settings. Those are all pieces established, along with INL, I should also say, since 1985, since the era of SROs began, by these agencies in response to the challenges of stabilization and reconstruction operations. And that's an interesting and complex panoply of capacities. But is it integrated? I think that's a fair question to continue to ask, and one that Deputy Secretary Burns answered in my interview with him. He said the CSO was an important creation, but just a step towards our continuing collective improvement to our capacity to address the challenges of stabilization and reconstruction operations. Ambassador Crocker, in my interview with him and in our discussions for hard lessons, believes this is the way to go, as does General Scowcroft and a number of interviewees that I talked to, General Austin, for example, in developing learning from Iraq. The second lesson, simple one, as many have said to me, why is that a lesson? And it is, ensure sufficient security before engaging in significant rebuilding. A fair question, why is that a lesson? It's a lesson because it's what happened in Iraq. We pushed forward with too large a program in the midst of a security situation that was rapidly deteriorating in 2003 and 2004. Began to shift course in late 2004 with Ambassador Negroponte's reprogrammings, but those very large IDIQs frankly weren't realized in their full capacity because of the security situation that unfolded and was not remedied until 2007. A lot of money was wasted, not enough was accomplished. But it's a pretty simple metric. The greater the level of insecurity, the smaller the project. And if it's massively insecure, don't engage in a rebuilding program other than possibly small tactical SERP-oriented, Commander's Emergency Response Program-oriented projects. Third lesson, consult. Consult with the host country. And this is what I heard repeatedly from Prime Minister Maliki, Deputy Prime Minister Shahristani, from the Minister of Finance Essawi, from Dr. Bassett, from all of the Iraqis, the failure to consult, and also soberly acknowledged on the U.S. side by Ambassador Jeffrey, General Austin, General Petraeus. General Petraeus makes a great point in his interview, and I commend it to you in Learning from Iraq, and that is, as a first premise in engaging in a stabilization and reconstruction operation, you have to fully understand, grasp the culture, the society, the economy, the politics, the people, their capacities, their needs rather than their wants, before seriously planning a significant rebuilding program. And he acknowledged, others acknowledged, that wasn't done sufficiently in Iraq. But when the question gets asked to me, what, was the Iraq program worth it? And I think that's for the Iraqis to answer, not for us to answer per se. And what they say is that we didn't get what we really needed sufficiently because you didn't consult adequately with us in 2003. I think that consultation problem also persisted. Our police development program audits revealed that we did not talk to the Ministry of Interior sufficiently about what they really needed with regard to continuing the improvement of their security forces on the civil side. And as a result, it was a program that, for which hundreds of millions were spent and very little was accomplished. Number 4, develop uniform systems. This is a companion lesson from number 1. If there is a uniform capacity, an integrated capacity rather than a coordinated capacity established with a primary duty to plan, then you'll get uniform systems. But for instance, General Bostic, the commander of the Corps of Engineers, who was also the first head of the Gulf Region Division, told me that we need a contingency federal acquisition regulation. That is, a common set of contracting rules that everybody uses at least for the first 90 to 180 days of a stabilization operation. That was not the case in Iraq and Afghanistan or any of our operations because that's not the law. The law now is that each agency has its own federal acquisition regulation. They differ among themselves and thus present challenges to contractors, to oversight, and to execution because of their varying complexities. But also, we should have a uniform IT system. There was no system that everyone used to keep track of what we were building in Iraq. And as a result, as our reviews of the Iraq Reconstruction Management System point out, the one that was created but not used sufficiently, we only have data record of about 70% of what we accomplished. Personnel regulations should be made uniform too, so that there is more synchronicity among the varying departments as they deploy individuals to contribute. Virtually no one spent more than a year in Iraq for the most part, and the synergies were lost in the varying interagency personnel management processes. Number 5, ensure robust oversight. I think that's a lesson that's learned from SIGIR's work, from SIGIR's work, and the reality that there really wasn't much oversight the first year. The Congress recognized that and deployed that, and the Commission on Wartime Contracting recommended that a special inspector general for overseas contingency operations be created. The Congress hasn't yet, but it has taken steps in the last NDAA to promote more oversight for stabilization and reconstruction operations, and I think that's a good thing, both because auditing and investigations are important to ensure compliance with the law, but also as a deterrent effect. I think the robust presence of an oversight office in country has an immeasurably important deterrent effect upon behavior. Number 6, preserve what worked. There were successes, and you'll find them in learning from Iraq, as we point out. And indeed, there were 2 reconstruction programs, just to highlight one aspect of success, the one in Kurdistan and the one in the Southern 15. The Kurdish projects were virtually all very good. The Erbil water treatment system, the single best large project that we accomplished, and one that the Kurds have added to, is now servicing most of Erbil, the capital city of Kurdistan, and Floor did a great job constructing it. That sort of success needs to be captured in learning how we succeeded. And in that case, there was no violence in Kurdistan. But the provincial reconstruction teams and the Commander's Emergency Response Program, 2 innovative aspects that came out of Iraq, had challenges, as we pointed out, but when they worked very well. They were both developed in the laboratory of the Iraq program, and I think that they should be captured. And finally, plan comprehensively. It's a simple lesson, but planning is not an as many have told me, an endemic aspect of sort of civilian engagement for stabilization and reconstruction operations, chiefly because it's not the primary duty of any particular entity. And I think clarification of who's in charge will identify who should be doing the planning. This was an issue that came up repeatedly in interviews. Qubad Talabani, the son of Jalal, said, you came in and you had a plan A but no plan B, and the situation devolved because you didn't have the resilience that a plan B would have provided. And instead, as the foreign minister for Kurdistan, Dr. Bakir, told me, he was dealing with state and defense and aid interlocutors who were constantly at odds with one another. And that particular criticism came out repeatedly in my interviews with the Iraqis, both in Kurdistan and in Baghdad. And I think that's because there is a lack of clarity about who's in charge of planning, executing, and overseeing stabilization and reconstruction operations. So thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here. I look forward to your questions and engagement with the panel, and as we reflect upon how these lessons from Iraq can be applied to North Africa and really to any stabilization and reconstruction operation, because we will be seeing them again. Thank you.
I think you're next. Okay. Glad to be back at USIP, particularly sitting beside Manal Omar and with this distinguished panel. Stuart, it was good to see you again. We talked last week. And it's also good that USIP is focused forward and looking forward. There's a tendency, of course, for IGs in particular to look back and to investigate people, and this opportunity that USIP provides to look forward and draw some positive, draw some lessons, some of which positive, and Stuart will point out some not so positive, but nonetheless to be able to looking forward and not trying to put people in jail and decide how many dollars we wasted. This I think is a good thing that USIP does well, and I'm very glad to see that continues. The lessons from Iraq and Afghanistan, as you point out, we've had a decade of opportunity to learn some things, and many people in this room have served both in Afghanistan and Iraq, and so we can draw those lessons from both sides. And I think the first big lesson that is not one of Stuart's 7, but nonetheless is a lesson that we can pull out of this, is that another SRO, Stabilization Reconstruction Operation, along the lines, to the magnitude, at the magnitude of what we saw in Afghanistan and Iraq is unlikely. We're not likely to see it anytime soon. Not to say we don't have to think about it and plan for it and learn lessons from mistakes we've made and opportunities we've had in the past, but the likelihood of American soldiers being on the ground in a Middle East country or another country and being responsible for rebuilding, reconstruction, I think is pretty low at this point. And you talk to the military and they will say the same thing, and you talk to people in the United States. I have a good friend, Jack Siegel, who retired from the Foreign Service and is now living out in Michigan, and he asked me to come out and speak to his foreign policy group. And he was, again, in a couple of weeks ago, and the striking thing about Americans and their discussions, and these are all very well-informed Americans, is that they are not convinced that we have a great stake in, let's just say, Syria, as an example, which is the one that we're focused on right now. There's a debate in this city and others about what we should be doing on Syria, and lessons from Iraq and Afghanistan are certainly in our minds. But what we don't hear is talk about a lot, either from the United States side or from the Syrian side, is talk about having soldiers, U.S. soldiers, on the ground in Syria. It's just not one of there. So I think that's one lesson that we ought to, as a backdrop to this. Either Thomas Friedman or Colin Powell or Rich Armitage called on the Pottery Barn rule about breaking and owning. My sense is we are we're handling the pottery more carefully these days. One of the lessons that we do need to take and are taking is in Syria, again, and Stuart said we're going to try to apply these lessons to not North Africa, but at least the Middle East, is the concern that after Assad goes, that there be something left, that there be some institutions left, whether they be the institutions that do the finance work, or that manage essential services, or that protect the chemical weapons, or that protect the borders, or the police. We would like, again, to learn from some of the negative lessons of Iraq, that those institutions we need to try to maintain. We, the international community, but certainly the Syrian opposition that we're talking about. So I think that lesson is there for us to pick. Stuart's security first lesson, absolutely. I can't argue. No one can argue with that. I remember sitting in the BUA, and this is Battle Update Assessment. Thank you. We were all sitting, other people in this room have been sitting in this BUA, where General Casey was sitting up here, and he had all his implementers and commanders, and John was probably there. Minions. We were all out there. Robert McGuire was sitting in there often as well. And we can all recall day after, this is like, I don't know, 7 in the morning, and morning after morning, the briefer would get up there and describe the latest electricity transmission tower that Robert McGuire was responsible for that was blown up last night, and how it had been rebuilt. And General Casey wanted to know when it was going to be back in service, and that it was destroyed again, and when was it going to be back in service yet again. So this notion of security first, in particular for the big projects, is a very important one. Can't argue. I think this is the small projects we can do. And again, going to the Syria lesson, we are already doing some of the small projects in Syria. We have funded and OTI, one of the organizations Stuart mentioned, the Office of Transition Initiatives at USAID, has now been well funded to provide small projects, to implement small projects in the liberated part, in the opposition controlled parts of Syria, in particular in the northwest, where these will help the Syrian people who are living there get along, get on with their lives. And it's a demonstration that the Syrian opposition coalition, this group that has put together a Syrian opposition, is able to provide services to the Syrian people in that part. So we are, and those are small. Those are very small. We're talking about under 100,000. We're talking about 20, 50, $75,000 projects on a bakery or on fixing electricity to this building. It's that kind of small thing that we can do. On the host country buy-in, we've learned some lessons there, and again, agree fully with this lesson. But let me just, as a counter example, Stuart mentioned that when Ambassador Negroponte arrived, he asked me to take a look at this $18.4 billion project list that we had, that we inherited, and examine whether or not we were spending the money in the right place. And of course, as you know, you read the book, Stuart wrote it up, we found we weren't doing it exactly the way we were. And indeed, security was beginning to be a very big problem for the reasons that I just described. So we had to take funds. We had a lot of money. We had over $18 billion, but we were spending them on very large projects, designed before we got there in the expectation that security would be okay. And in that kind of environment that they had anticipated when they designed these big projects, this design with multi-layered contractors might have worked. But it didn't work in the environment, in the security environment that we inherited, that we were there in 2004, 2005. So we reallocated the funds a couple of times, actually. And on the host country buy-in, it fell to me to go to several ministers, but I remember one in particular of water resources utilities. Robert, I don't know if you came with me on that time, but this was this was a horrible meeting I had, because contrary to the point about no host country buy-in, this minister was very bought in. She thought she was getting 3 big water treatment plants, and she knew exactly where they were going to be, and what they were, the people they would serve, and the political benefit that she and others would get from this. She was very bought in to this thing, and I had to tell her, you know, those 3 you thought you were going to get from us? Well, you're not, because we have to shift funds from those things to General Petraeus, who was managing the. Who also I sat beside him at the BUA. We had assigned seats at the BUA, so I had to take money from this minister and give it to General Petraeus so that he could train up the police and the military. She's not pleased, but she was definitely bought in. It turns out, as Stuart mentioned, as he relates in the book, that we had to do this a couple of times. We did a couple of these reviews. I had to go back to the same minister, and after the same thing, saying, sorry, we have to make some changes. She said, never come to my office again. This was very difficult. This was very difficult. Nonetheless, the lesson that Stuart makes about host country buy-in is important. We have begun to do this in Syria as well. In particular, again, I've mentioned the Syrian Opposition Coalition is the governing body that has been designated, kind of selected, with an elected president, and now we have a prime minister. And our notion, our goal on the Syria project is to enable that organization to do some things. I mentioned earlier small projects. We are giving that SOC, the Syrian Opposition Coalition, the ability to direct cash. We are giving them the ability to direct small projects that OTI will do. So when the SOC, with their connections into Syria, into the governorates of Syria, into the towns and the local councils in Syria, identify a project, be it fairly small or even fairly good size now, they will be able to they will have to have the resources from us to be able to accomplish those projects. So that kind of host country buy-in, we're taking that lesson. I didn't address all of the 7 lessons, but those are the main ones that jumped out at me, Stuart. Thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to questions.
Great. As a longtime student of organizational learning, I'm absolutely delighted about this project. As a former battalion operations officer in Al Anbar in 2003-2004, trying desperately to spend SERP funds in the right way and not go to jail, I also applaud this work, and I would hope that I can be a little bit of a voice from the field in that. As a history professor, Stuart talked about grabbing the lessons from Bosnia. I'm a history professor. I'd like to go back even further than that. I see Rufus Phillips in the audience, a Vietnam veteran who's done so much to gather and capture and present forward lessons from Vietnam. I'd remind all of us that the lesson the nation took from Vietnam was we're never going to do that again. Right? And that attitude is a big part of the reason why we were so woefully unprepared for Iraq and Afghanistan on both the civilian and the military side. And I certainly agree that the cost we have paid in both wars has been excessive. I think a big part of that has been due to failures on our part, mistakes on our part, many of which Ambassador Taylor, Stuart have already touched upon. I'll touch on a couple more. But the idea that we're never going to do this again it's not even creeping in, it's walking into the room on both legs. And the fact is that these problems are not going to go away. Right? We are currently supporting insurgencies in Libya, Egypt, Syria, just off the top of my head, we're currently conducting counterinsurgency, fighting against insurgencies in Afghanistan, Pakistan, the Philippines, and Yemen. These problems are still going to be with us for as far as the eye can see, and that's why this effort is so important and why I applaud Stuart for the work he's done in USIP for hosting this discussion. We've got to do it better, and if we do not learn the lessons that have been paid for with American blood, with American dollars, they should come back and get us from the afterlife. I'm particularly concerned that I think so many of these lessons were captured in a document, an important document, I think, the first ever Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review, the QDDR. State was having review envy, and put together a really good project that sadly, for all of its commendable recommendations, was dead on arrival because the State Department's budget, USAID's budget, has gone in the wrong direction since that was published, right? And so we have done, as individual institutions, I think, as with Stuart's work, we've captured a lot of lessons. We have not, as a nation, decided to implement them, to fund them. I'm going to talk very, very briefly about a military study that reinforces some of Stuart's lessons that I'm bringing up simply because it hasn't gotten the attention it deserves. This is the Joint Staff's Decade of War study published in June of last year. It has, Stuart had 7 recommendations. It has 11. That is, of course, because the military is bigger than the civilian side of government. It also arguably is because the military made more mistakes. I'm only going to highlight 3 of them. First, as the Minerva professor tasked to bring an understanding of culture and the environment into the Department of Defense, I'm going to highlight that as the first lesson of the Decade of War study. This is something that the civilian agencies, the civilian side of government, USIP and all of its contacts can do very, very well for the American military if the military is willing to listen. And so one of the things I hope is that understanding that when we fight wars among the people, we have to know these people among whom we're working. We have to understand their relationships, their power structures, how their economies work. And we were woefully unprepared for that, both in Iraq and in Afghanistan. The second of the 3 of those 11 I'm going to highlight is the battle for the narrative. This is arguably, according to the Counterinsurgency Field Manual, the most important line of operations in a counterinsurgency campaign is the information operations campaign. It is described as the decisive line of operations in that campaign. It is also cleverly the line of operations we are least good at, least equipped to do. And frankly, it's not something I particularly want the American military doing, but only the military is resourced to do it. And so some combination of smart civilian government folks, institutions like this, and the American military need to come together to figure out how to fight and win the battle of the narrative. It remains astounding to me that this country, which does that so well with consumer products, is not as good at selling ideas like liberty, freedom, and security. And the last of the lessons I'll highlight from the Joint Staff study also echoes something that Stuart said. This is the problem of host nation partnering. This is if the battle for the narrative is the thing that the nation has done worst at in learning from this decade of war. Host nation partnering is the part that the military has done worst, and I'm enormously concerned. I think Stuart would agree that on the civilian side we have a whole lot of work to do, but also on the military side we have not built the security force assistance capability that is so desperately required as enabling our exit from any of these situations. And that's another lesson that we should have learned in Vietnam and clearly still have not learned. That's been pretty negative. I'd like to close with one positive. It's hard to find positives in all of this, quite frankly, in this decade of war, which has cost us so much for so little gain. But if there is one silver lining in these dark clouds, I think it is the performance of this generation of young Americans, civilians and military, who have volunteered to serve in the line of fire. And I'm privileged to teach some of them at our Naval Academy today. I'm reminded we should all remember the State Department just lost a very bright young talent this very week. But this generation of young Americans who have volunteered to serve in these wars, knowing what they were getting into, who have trusted us, their elders, to use their lives wisely, right? They have learned these hard lessons on the ground. We owe it to them to at our levels, be far, far more careful about the employment of American power, be far more humble about what we think we can accomplish with American power, and always be grateful to them for the sacrifices that they have made. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to echo my colleagues. It's a great honor to be here with my fellow panelists and also to be dealing with this topic. And I have to say that for very selfish reasons, I was excited when I saw this book. For my personal things, I always feel like I'm torn between two different positions. One is while I'm in the U.S. is really sharing what's happening in the region, what's happening on the ground. But every time I travel to the region, I'm asked, will the U.S. stop and actually learn from Iraq? Are people going to be held accountable? And I was in Beirut last week for a convening of mediators from across the region. So before I went, I sent out the link. So I said, before you ask me the question, you always ask me, please read this. And I was very excited when I arrived that many people did read it and were very happy, even in terms of some of the prosecutions, because for them that meant accountability and to a certain level transparency. The report is also available in Arabic, which I think is very important to show again that although mistakes were made, there is a point in time, it may be late in the game, but there isn't a point in time where people stop, take stock, and to a certain extent there is accountability. I think one of the things that I'm going to highlight, which for those of you who know me is very ironic, is I will be focusing as my first lesson learned on the positives. And I think it's very important that we don't get caught between successes and failures. If you remember kind of the last 10 years in Iraq, 2003, 2005, hey, it's positive, it's great. 2005, 2008, no, we're failing, it's a success. 2000, no, it's positive again. And I think one of the things when we're looking at a lot of these operations is recognizes that the successes and failures are going to come in parallel, and they're going to come within each phase. And we need to be prepared for them. We need to be prepared, particularly with the failures, to take note and stop what we're doing and shift strategies if need be, but also to take a lot of caution with celebrating the successes as they come and really highlighting them both to our own government but to the people on the ground and the leaderships we've partnered with. And I know it's difficult. I mean, I, for one, again, it's ironic that I'll be highlighting the successes because, I was in Iraq in December and I found it very difficult, very challenging, to be going around, traveling and seeing things or actually not back to where they are in 2003. But I also felt very proud because the civil society activists that I had worked with 10 years ago today are at a very different phase. The civil society activists, all across Iraq, and we're not just talking about the NGOs. I mean, we recognize that there, are NGOs, but the university professors, the unions, the students. I mean, there's a wide range of activism across that I think is really worth taking note. Also remembering that it was civil society that took the Iraqi government to court when they failed to form government in time according to the Constitution. So I do think it's worth noting. I mean, again, like any other sector, they're also plagued. I mean, there's corruption, limited capacity, a lot of challenges, but they are at a very different position than they were 10 years ago. And a lot of that is thanks to the programs and the work that's been done through the international community. At the same time, you are able to see that although security remains to be a challenge, particularly in Baghdad, there are improvements in certain parts of the country. And it's important that we don't make the same mistake of determining success by looking at Iraq as a whole, but actually looking across. I mean, what you're seeing in the north, what you're seeing in the south is better security, is some stabilization efforts. You are seeing that the Iraqi police, a lot of difficulties with programs, a lot of challenges, and with everything that I say that exists, but there is a pride between the Iraqi people in terms of seeing that security, the police are now the ones manning the checkpoint. Over and over, that's flagged to me that, look, may not be the best, but at least it's our boys who are now there, who are taking control with, of course, the challenges in being realistic. Iraqi economy is moving in the right direction. Their production has gone up. There is more investment again in potential tourism Qasem and Najaf and Karbala. You're seeing in the north, not only internationally, but also within Iraq. I mean, at one point, when I was living in Iraq in 97 and 98, people from the South Center had never been to the north. Now it's very common not only for them to have been to the north, but actually been outside the region. And the only reason why I highlight the successes isn't necessarily to say that Iraq is in a good position. We all acknowledge the challenges, but it is just to make sure that we don't fall trap into the quick classifications. I think the Middle East region has been really torn between these type of spectrums. We're either at war or it's full peace. We either have a dictator or we're told we're going to have chaos. And I think one of the things that we need to learn is to start presenting third and fourth scenarios, not to get continuously stuck between the extremes, and to say actually things will take time. And that leads me to the other lesson learned, which I think is particularly important for North Africa, but clearly from our experience in Iraq, one of the first steps is to manage expectations. Not only expectations of the streets. I hear that a lot. There is acknowledgement, people are unrealistic. But even with our partnerships, with our allies, with the opposition groups, with the leadership that we're working with, is to make sure that we manage expectations, both in terms of what is U.S. actual influence. I mean, when I am in the region and I hear what people think the U.S. can do or what they think the U.S. can solve, and they feel betrayed because they're not doing it, I'm astounded because, as far as I'm concerned or as I'm aware, it isn't within the U.S. power to actually do or implement what people are thinking that should be done. So, managing expectations, not only on the street level, which is important, but also with our leadership and our partners, I think is very important from day one. The other thing I would say is maximizing our window of opportunity. And this goes back to why this is very important, is in reality, we have a short period of time. I mean, I was very surprised when I arrived in Iraq as early as July 2003 and saw the level of excitement and saw the people willing to step up and cooperate and, the partnership, but it was a short window of opportunity. And, the same thing when you look into Libya or even when I was in Egypt, particularly when I was traveling outside of Cairo, I mean, there was a very strong desire for partnership, but that window of opportunity is very small. And if they don't see tangible results or tangible partnerships, it can quickly dissolve and, worst case scenario, flip to the actual opposite. So I think, recognizing that there is a small window of opportunity and how do we maximize, particularly when we enter. I think the other issue I would flag is, there is an assumption, I think, particularly among policymakers, that if a country has oil, then there's not going to be need for long-term investment. We're already hearing that rhetoric on Libya. And I think that's something we need to be very cautious about, because although they have the potential, they don't necessarily have the finance or procurement structures. They don't have, concepts of decentralization so that it's actually shared across the country. So there is still a need, at least at the upfront, for investment to be able to strengthen and build the institutions before then we can say the country is, has oil and can spend on itself. And particularly if we want to see marginalized groups in civil society grow, that will need a certain level of investment, and that we can't just depend on the host country to start funding, immediately. Of course, and I think the report covers this, the concept of role modeling. I mean, if we're talking about transparency, if we're talking about being, able to be inclusive, we need to role model that in terms of our contracting procedures, who we partner with. We all know the international community tends to have their favorite little darlings that we continuously tend to fund, and then that tends to exclude other groups. And so we have to become more aware and proactive of how we can diversify that. And that means getting outside of the capital. That means not only having online submissions for grants, it means not only doing it in English, but actually developing, which then means increased funding for operational costs, developing policies where you're able to go to the unusual suspects, bring in the rural area, bring in the people who might not necessarily have the same literacy or English fluency that is easy to work with as partners. One of the other issues I would flag is agreeing on terminology, and I think this is particularly important with working with media, but also in any public awareness campaigns. And I just look at Iraq and the word federalization, and when USIP did a media incitement survey with Iraqi media professionals, one of the top 10 words of incitement was federalization. And people were using it as separation, the terminology. You're seeing it now in Libya with the same word, federalization. You're seeing it in Tunisia with the word secularization. It means different things to different people. So agreeing on terminology and unpacking it, I think particularly within the media, but also in public awareness campaigns, is a very important issue. I fully support, as always, the concept of consultation. I would only add to triangulate the information. A lot of times, if we are consulting, finding ways, particularly including civil society and other voices, I think is going to be important. And keeping in mind along the consultation that the diaspora are one of the stakeholders. Sometimes there's a disproportionate, amount of consultation with diaspora. It goes back to the English, and it goes back to access. They're often in country, in capitals, willing to come to the embassies, willing to go through security. And what tends to happen is we have a disproportionate amount of information from one particular group. That's best case scenario. Sometimes worst case scenarios, we actually create divides. And this is a huge potential in Libya and Tunisia because, people who tend to get the jobs, people who tend to get the positions tend to be from the diaspora community, which is essential. They play an important role and can really help add in terms of the human resource challenges. But if we're not balancing it out with making sure that people who haven't had the opportunity to leave or to learn English or to have higher education are also incorporated, then we can actually feed into a divide. Which brings me to kind of the question of how we do programs and how we fund programs. I already mentioned going outside the usual suspects, but I think it's time for us to really step back and really challenge the theories of change that we've maybe taken for granted for a long period of time. For example, it's very common belief that entrepreneurial or the economy, which clearly plays a role in conflict and can clearly play a role in counter-violent extremism, but a lot of times the programmings we do also create an artificial market. We flood the market with a particular skill set without tying it to a market analysis. So you have people, giving up arms, going into these programs, learning a job skill, but then not finding a job. And it creates animosity, and again, it creates a feeling of betrayal. We gave up something, we joined your program, but we didn't get the result that was promised. Testing the theories of change with women and youth are also important. Again, we had a lot of rhetoric for women. If some of the rhetoric got to the point where some people imagined maybe Iraq would have a female president. There was a lot of dedication, on women in Afghanistan, and we even put a lot of money. But when it came to the negotiation between political power, we were a little bit willing to negotiate some of those issues away. Women, youth, minorities, we funded it, we talked a lot about it, but the political will to actually stand behind the marginalized group, I think was a little, wasn't as strong as it could have been, and something that we should look at because, again, the feeling of betrayal from these sectors are very strong, and the feeling of being left behind. I'll end with the idea of, what I hope is learned in a lot of the programming element is that process is as important as the output. And I think nothing tells the story better than the Iraqi Constitution. And, having a constitution in itself isn't always just a success, but the process and looking at the Constitution as a social contract, a time for negotiation, a time to really deal with a national dialogue of reconciliation. And if you skip those steps, you end up back, 10 years later to the exact same issues that were pushed aside in order to try and come up with an outcome or a constitution or agreeing on the least common denominator. And I promise that would be my final point, but I'll actually make one more final point, is that when we are working in communities, a lot of times we enter with the divides in mind. So, we enter and we're thinking about Kurd, Arab, Sunni, Shia, and I think that, that's realistic in the background, but developing and designing the programs to really highlight what's in common or what's needed in the communities will yield better results than designing programs built on divides.
Thank you all for your very interesting presentations. I'm going to just ask a couple of questions in lieu of making comments. They'll be a little elaborate, but and then I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions. I'd like to say, as the moderator, I'm going to set one rule for the answers, both for my questions and for those from the audience, is that you aren't allowed to say it's too soon to tell, even if that's the only legitimate answer to the question. First is for our keynote speaker, Stuart. I was wondering if you considered, and this is a funny question coming from a journalist, but how your auditing and reporting of what was really going on served the larger military mission. And I know that this question was posed to me as a journalist in a different way, where I've had many troops, when I've been embedded in Iraq and Afghanistan, ask me, would you have reported Abu Ghraib, or if you could go back, would you have reported on the horrible abuses going on in Abu Ghraib, knowing the damage, which I think is undeniable, that that did to American prestige and to the American mission in Iraq. And I can say that we in the press certainly cherished your openness and the way you published the findings. I was able to jump into my little Toyota and drive up to Diyala province and see Khani Bani Saad, this enormous white whale of a prison that no one ever wanted. Can you remind me how many millions were spent?
40 million.
$40 million for a prison that no one ever wanted, that was built so badly that it was abandoned. And I haven't been there since 2010, but I think it's safe to assume it's still sitting empty in the desert.
Pile of rubble.
Pile of rubble, okay. So did you ever consider that your reporting of this sort of live in real time during this military mission was something that was doing damage as well as good?
It was brought to my attention, actually.
I bet it was.
So I didn't have to consider it sua sponte. But my response to that and really to the entire mission was to craft this oversight office in a way that I think differs from other IG oversight offices. Bill knows that from the beginning. I mean, we were transparent. Transparency is as transparency does, is one of my mantras, and that means we were open about everything we were doing. Unlike any other IG shop, I sent a weekly report to the ambassador, to Bill, and to the commanding general about what we were doing, what audits we had ongoing, who we were talking to, and also more than that, it was my view that from the start, very early on, that we had to do more than run a list of findings or a list of convictions. That was not going to work. We had to generate reports quickly so that the ambassador and the commanding general knew what was going on. I viewed our reporting as intelligence, frankly, about the program for them to make decisions. And that's why I listened to them, to Ambassador Negroponte, to Ambassador Crocker, to General Petraeus, to General Odierno, about what they wanted us to look at. I've traveled to Iraq every quarter for 9 years on average, and in the early years spent upwards of 2 months there, as you remember, Bill, and met with the ambassador and the generals and the heads of IRMO and ITAU and ISPO and all of the iterations thereof, and asked them, what they wanted us to look at. What did you need insight into? And the other thing that I told my auditors is that we're going to get 6 to 8 audits done every quarter, which is somewhat unprecedented. And we average inspections and audits together 12 reports a quarter, and that is what I think helped make a difference. To your Abu Ghraib question, it wasn't in my jurisdiction, but my statute actually had a particular provision that allowed the Department of Defense, if it felt that a report would breach a security issue, to require us to keep it classified, and we only had to do that once. Of the 390 reports we issued, 1 was requested to be classified.
Right. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I nitpick your question quickly?
Sure.
So Cole, you asked whether Stuart thought that he was hurting the military mission. My response would be that we didn't have a military mission in Iraq. We had a mission in Iraq that required the military and the civilian sides to get together and do things in conjunction. And Stuart's first point is that we didn't have any organization to do that, either in planning or in execution. So we have to understand that these problems are not just military problems, but it's the military that has all the resources, and we've got to find a way to make them work together.
And so my next question is for all 4 of our panelists. John, you mentioned this about controlling the narrative in a counterinsurgency, how important that is. And I'm wondering about the lasting public perception of the good and the bad works that were done both in Iraq and in Afghanistan. I can think of I'm trying to think of symbols of visible signs as I would drive around Baghdad, And there wasn't something people could point to and say, oh, the Americans built this, and this is what we'll always remember the Americans did. Unfortunately, the only symbol is the U.S. Embassy, which is this shining campus, which we all wondered if might someday be donated and turned into a university or something like that, which would then allow Iraqis driving around Baghdad to say, look at that gorgeous building the Americans built and gave to us. There wasn't much else around that people could point to. In Afghanistan, driving into that country in 2001 as the Taliban were falling, the lasting symbols, structures were built by the British a century earlier, or they were built by the Soviets and some by the Americans in the 50s. But having just left my last posting in Afghanistan last summer, there really was still not much around where Afghans could say, oh, the Americans built this for us, and that's going to last. Some of the roads, yes, but of course the security situation fell away, and they were hard to drive those roads now. It struck me last winter and the winter before as Afghan refugees from the fighting in the south were dying of cold, of exposure in camps right in the capital city of Kabul, which doesn't have a significant security problem. And these Afghans, mostly Pashtun refugees, were saying, where is America? Why aren't they helping us? We're freezing to death this winter. Our children are dying in their first weeks of life because we can't keep them warm and we don't have food for them. Well, the answer was, of course, that America was helping them. Of course, USAID had emergency funds that they were able to distribute in the form of blankets and food and fuel. But the situation was such that they couldn't put their names on that aid because anyone in that camp who had anything resembling an American flag or a USAID or the letters US on it was going to be subject to reprisals. And that makes me wonder what we are doing now, what we can do in the future to make sure, I don't think this is a cynical consideration, that the help that we do give engenders goodwill. Do the Syrian refugees around the borders of Syria now, are they getting help from America, and are they going to remember that the United States helped them out in their time of need? This is perhaps something that we need to think about as this completely uncertain future unfolds in Syria. We want to have some friends when the dust settles, and what are we doing to make sure that that happens? So that was my elaborate question. I'll encourage you in the audience not to ask such long-winded questions because it's bad form, but here we go. Who'd like to comment?
I think if you look at the case of Libya, I think that was successful. Where, you know, I traveled into Benghazi pre-Tripoli being liberated and Gaddafi falling, and, you know, there was a very strong acknowledgement from the Libyans saying, thank you, we're grateful, we know that it's an international or NATO intervention, but we also know that the U.S. is playing a role. And until today, even after the tragedy, Ambassador Stevens, I mean, literally I was getting calls all night from all over Libya, people saying, this is not the Libyan people, we're still grateful, we still have gratitude, and again, that window of opportunity is still open when you're looking at Libya. I think within other areas in the Arab Spring, I think there is a question or an impression that the U.S. could do more. I think even within Syria, there is an acknowledgement of support of humanitarian, but there is also a question of why is it not ending? Why is there not things? So, I think there has to be just a little bit of reality. No matter how much can be done, we're always going to be a drop in a very vast ocean, and there's always going to be something that we could be doing more of better. So that's why I go back to the idea of managing expectations is actually, I think, more key than just trying to provide the assistance. It has to come in hand with some type of outreach where you're saying that this is what we can do, but we actually can't do more for whatever reasons.
A couple of comments. Building on Manal's attempt to move this into kind of North Africa and this. So Egypt. We've been thinking about this question What are we leaving there? Well, we've been doing a lot of work in Egypt. USAID in Egypt has spent billions and billions of dollars over 30 years. A lot of that has been for things that no one sees. A lot of that has been for water treatment, sewage, and a lot of good work has been, an incredible amount of good work. The people of Egypt have clean water today because of USAID. Now, if you ask the people of Egypt if they know that, no. The answer is no. It's, first of all, the government of Egypt didn't want to broadcast this, and second of all, it's all underground. You don't see it. So we were asking ourselves this question not too long ago, Manal, about what it would be that we would leave, after the revolution. And people, when you go to Cairo, I'm sure you heard this, they will point to the opera house, and they say, the Japanese gave us that opera house, So we said, should we do something like that? No, we decided that was not what we were going to try to do. We gave a lot of thought to what it would be. One of the big things that we're going to do in Egypt is a very large scholarship program. We are going to reach out to women in particular, but people around Egypt more broadly, in parts of Egypt that don't normally apply for scholarships to overseas. We're going to put a lot of funds into that. The current prime minister, to talk about how it's last, the current Prime Minister Kandil, remembers very well, and he's probably talked to people in this room, I know he's probably talked to Manal, and he recalls that USAID paid for his master's degree at the University of Utah, and I think he attributes his PhD, although I think this is probably not the case, but he attributes the PhD at North Carolina State also to USAID, and that lasted. That lasted, and that had an effect. And it's not just him. It's a lot of people who have that. So that's the kind of thing that we would like to build. It's a lasting thing that will be there when the dust settles, on that kind of thing. Just briefly on branding, because you make a good point, Quill, that is, if you're working for Mercy Corps, and you're taking humanitarian assistance, food, medicine across the border from Turkey into Syria, you are in danger. You are in danger. In particular, you're in danger if there's American flag flying or if it's branded as from the people of the United States. So we want to get the humanitarian assistance in because there are people suffering, as your question implied. But B, we don't want to get the Mercy Corps and other international NGO volunteers, workers, killed. So that's a tension for us on how to brand this, and there are ideas on how we can do this, but that's a real tension that we haven't resolved even yet.
Okay, I think we're ready to take questions from the audience. So I'd ask that you identify yourself and please make sure it was a question, not a rambling statement like mine. Right here in the front row, or in the third row here. Yes. Sure. Wait for the microphone, please. For the viewers at home.
Hi, thanks. Jeremy Pam, Columbia University. Thanks to USIP for stimulating conversation about lessons learned looking forward, and thanks to Stuart and SIGIR for all of the critical contributions that you've made to this effort. My question builds on what I take to be a major theme of the report, which you mentioned, Stuart, in your overview, which is that one of the big problems was a failure to, or inadequate consultation with Iraqis, and I think coupled with that, a failure to take adequate account of the sustainability of assets built. And I think those are related because, of course, if we don't consult with the people that will be responsible for sustainment in the out years when the U.S. or international presence decreases, whatever scale we're talking about, then that will create sustainability problems. And so my question has two parts. First, do those problems with the failure to consult, the sort of structural problems with our inadequate consultation and inadequate taking account of sustainability suggests the need for a different conception of planning. Because, of course, if consultation is critical, the best Washington plan is, by definition, not going to, is going to have significant limitations in the degree to which it has consulted those on the ground who ultimately will be responsible for sustaining things. And then, of course, there are various ways of getting around that, and Bill has described extensive consultations with Syrian groups, but I think we all understand that there are limitations. The military says no plan survives contact with reality, and I think I'd suggest that perhaps a reconstruction plan survives contact with with the host nation even less, because they have not only a vote, but the critical vote going forward. So the first question is about sort of the need for a different conception of planning. And the second is just asking all of the panelists what your thoughts are on the most useful host country frameworks for institutionalizing consultation, for deciding what their priorities are, and for deciding what they want to commit to sustaining over the long term. Many of you know the context and the framework that I've worked most with has been local budgets, which is not just a finance ministry thing, but nationally and subnationally, involving representative bodies, involving civil society budget monitoring. But I wonder if you have any thoughts about that, or about other host country governance frameworks that might make consultation better next time.
All right, who'd like to take that? Sure, you want to take the second one?
Well, first of all, let me say, Jeremy, thanks for your service in Iraq and here at USIP. You made important contributions in both places from your Treasury experience, and I think that the Treasury experience overall in Iraq was, as we point out in Hard Lessons, a positive one, if in its stovepipe as well. The planning structure, first of all, the consultation issue comes not from our audits, or in particular, or the sustainment issue definitely comes from them. One that we identified early on in 2005. It comes from what the Iraqi leadership told me, and the U.S. leadership told me as well. Ambassador Crocker said there was frequently very little more than a head nod to, quote unquote, with regard to what projects would go forward, and with regard to what the Iraqis might want. But Prime Minister Maliki, his core point was this: you didn't consult with us enough. Deputy Prime Minister Shahrastani, Minister of Finance Asawi, that was his first point, and Ambassador Jeffrey made the same one as well. So it just was a theme teased out from these many interviews, both on the Iraqi and the U.S. side. But to your question, do we need a different planning structure? I'd say yes, we need to improve our planning. Absorbing this lesson, absorbing that we need to, if anything, overemphasize the need to plan. It is a challenge, as you say, to discern wants from needs and figure out who's the right interlocutor. And because of those challenges, you have to do more of it. You have to engage more deeply. You have to move more slowly. As Tom Knight said, bigger is not better. Think strategically. Move slowly at the outset in the kinds of projects you're pursuing, as opposed to what the CPA was doing, which was a very, very ambitious and large-scale remaking of Iraq. In hopes, they planned with the hope, shattered soon after the plan was introduced, that it would be able to be executed in a safe environment. That's really what undercut it. But Winston Churchill said, "Those who plan do better than those who don't, even if they rarely stick to that plan." And so simply emphasizing comprehensive, focused, engaged planning will strengthen the ultimate outcome.
I agree with everything Stuart just said, in particular the process of planning is useful, but the plan, or at least the analysis that underlies it, is enormously useful. And with so many young people in the audience, people writing, looking for topics for PhD dissertations, there is so much work to be done, and it's so desperately needed. So speaking as that battalion operations officer, who by the end of my year in Iraq had a pretty good picture of the insurgencies I was fighting. I could have drawn you network diagrams. I understood their families. I knew who I was fighting. I had no idea how to use the economic instrument of power, how to use my SERP funds to accomplish either my short-term counterinsurgency goals or the long-term economic development goals. I needed a level of fidelity of the economic situation in the sector I was working in that was every bit as detailed, every bit as integrated as the picture I had of the insurgency. So figuring out a way to get that, building models of that, understanding what the multiplier effects are of different kinds of investments in conflict zones, and that's going to change over time and according to the security situation, that could not be more valuable. That's the kind of work that USIP can do that will really help the men and women on the ground.
Just a quick answer to the second question that Jeremy asked on host country framework, or how to get input from the host country. This is really key, and in Afghanistan, as people in this room will recall, they had a finance minister early on, Ashraf Ghani, who attempted with mixed success to bring all of that planning and all of that reconstruction work into the Ministry of Finance. He brought it with trying to bring the international community in, and people resisted, and the Americans resisted, and the Europeans resisted. But that's got to be the key. In Syria right now, under this Syrian opposition coalition, there is an assistance coordination unit, an ACU. In fact, the new prime minister was the head of the ACU before he was elevated to be the prime minister. That ACU has become a competent organization that understands Syria certainly better than we do, or any international organization will do. And working through that, every donors conference, every donor meeting that we used to have in Tokyo and Berlin and all these, but it needs to happen in Gaziantep. It needs to happen right on the border, and the ACU needs to be in charge, or at least co-chairing it. That's the way to get that input.
Okay. Can we go up to the back? There's that Trudy. Okay. I thought that was you.
Hey, Trudy.
Just a quick follow-up, Ambassador Taylor.
Could you introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry, Trudy Rubin from the Philadelphia Inquirer.
Thanks.
Just talking about the Syria aid, could you tell us a little bit more about how that's working? Is the ACU picking the networks, and how do you deal with the fact that this competition now in the opposition from the new prime minister who comes from a different political background? And I would also like to ask Stuart Bowen, you talked about the need for security, and we all recognize that, but it seems that almost any instance of where we are going to be giving aid in what was a failed state, or what is just post-conflict but is still uncertain, is going to involve these security questions. And we seem to have failed over and over again in figuring out how to deal with aid in a difficult security environment, whether USAID or State Department people can go out at terrible risk. We know the tragedy that just happened. And whether we have to subcontract to unreliable contractors, subcontractors, and so on because of the security issue. Is there any way of dealing with that? Because it seems like it's going to be a recurring problem. Thank you.
Okay. So the ambassador first.
Trudy, thank you. On the Syria question and about assistance and the assistance coordination unit and the political angles of it, this is hard, and I won't say it's too early to tell, but I will say that it's very fluid. If you'd asked this question about the ACU 2 months ago, 60 days ago or so, the ACU was 2 or 3 people, not able to do any of the kind of work that I was just suggesting that they are now. Now they're 60. Now they've been able to hire people with some funds from us and some funds from other international donors, but they've been able to hire. They've put together an organization. We have, the ACU has not been, in my experience so far, ACU has not been riven by these kind of political conflicts, that it is apolitical so far. Hito, the former head of it, who's now the prime minister, Texan, you know, he's a Syrian American from Texas. He also has Kurdish background and is an interesting fellow. But while he was at the ACU, was not accused of, and we heard no reports of any of this tension that you refer, that is clearly there in the SOC, in the larger body.
And Trudy, as to your security question, I think it's a difficult question to answer, but a relatively straightforward tool to apply, in that the more unstable the situation, the smaller the project should be. And if it's extremely unstable, then you shouldn't proceed with rebuilding other than what makes tactical sense. As conditions improve, then larger scale rebuilding can ensue. As General Odierno said to me in my interview for Learning from Iraq, I wish I had the money that we had in 2004, 2005, 2006, in 2008, 2009, and 2010, because we could have done so much more, because it was possible to do so much more. And you know, it's conditions based, to use a term, a perennial term from the Iraq experience, and it's driven by the nature of the threat assessment. And on your subcontractor point, great one. I mean, the latest changes in the NDAA to contingency contracting are trying to penetrate that prime contractor wall, so to speak, with regard to government oversight. But it's a difficult one, a challenging one, and will require significant additional resourcing of our contracting capacity across the U.S. government before real progress can be made.
Let's go to the gentleman in the very last seat up there in the back.
Thank you very much. My name is Edward Joseph with Johns Hopkins SAIS. And what I'd like to do, if I could, is introduce a slightly different angle on the consultation question. It might be slightly beyond the ken of Mr. Bowen's outstanding work and report. But if we step back and look at what there is wide consensus as the two most serious mistakes of the Iraq endeavor, and that was disbanding the Iraqi army and de-Baathification. If you read Paul Bremer's account of that, his claim is that the reason he took those fateful decisions is precisely because of his consultation with Iraqi leaders. Of course, they were not Sunnis who he consulted, but others, and if we take him at his word, that's what he says. And if you could add a third catastrophic mistake that was made that was not Mr. Bremer's, which was the botched execution of Saddam Hussein on a Sunni holiday, which was also done out of deference. I have the question.
Okay, just curious.
Sure. No, the questions there, no longer than anyone else. So if you consider those three catastrophic errors, which I think many people would agree pale in comparison to anything else, sparking the insurgency that took so many American lives and Iraqi lives, what is the lesson there about consultation, where those who claim it say that they were acting precisely out of deference to the wishes of the local folks? Doesn't it mean at times, in fact, we shouldn't overdo the consultation, and in fact, we should say no? Thank you very much.
Consultation, Edward, great question, doesn't always mean saying yes. It means engaging with as many interlocutors as possible, not just, for instance, with regard to de-Baathification or disbanding the army with the Shia or the Kurds who wanted it because of the Sunni control of the army.
And who still think it was a good idea, by the way. I mean, if you ask President Barzani of the Kurdish region, who you're referring to, he'll say, of course, he wouldn't say this to a journalist or in public, but he thinks it's a great thing that the state was destroyed and continues to struggle.
But General Austin in Learning from Iraq and General Petraeus in Hard Lessons, and again echoing it in Learning from Iraq, recognize that those decisions fomented the insurgency. And so it was meeting a want of a particular group, which is why the more engagement with the greater number of interlocutors, the better your decision-making will be, and the better your consultation is, by definition. I also think that General Petraeus' point at the beginning of the interview is key to being able to unravel that matter, because it is a knotty one. And that is, you've got to understand before you enter the full scope of the cultural situation, the political situation, the economic situation, the societal conditions, the history, so that you can ascertain, hey, this is a part of a 1,300-year-old problem. It's part of a 30-year-old, 25-year-old problem. There are layers of analysis that have to figure in to making that decision. And interesting about that decision, on March 10th in 2003 at the NSC Principals meeting, the President approved not disbanding the Army, but using it as a Reconstruction Corps. Like the phrase is as Jay Garner briefed it, the head of the Organization for the Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance, was sort of like a New Deal reconstruction capacity that would be put to work in rebuilding Iraq. And that all changed in less than 2 months.
If I could just add, I think, again, that was a little bit my point of triangulating the information, but I think it's not only the issue, but it's how you go about it. So I think there are a lot of Iraqis who would say that it wasn't necessarily just the decision, it was how you then implemented it. What was the process? What were the actions and steps taken? And maybe that's where we drop the consultation, is where when we decide, we go into a very move forward action, and maybe we should have slowed down and actually consulted on some of the steps and the process and how it was done, not only what needed to be done.
One sentence.
Yes, go ahead.
And so we decided not to pay the members of the Iraqi Army, largely Sunnis, any bonus, any pension, anything. We reversed that a month later after the insurgency exploded in our faces, as many had warned it would if we followed that policy, but it was too late. Reversing it was too late. The window had already been broken.
Let's go to this gentleman here about halfway up. Yes, you, sir.
My name is Rufus Phillips, and I think John already mentioned me. One of the reasons that I wrote a book about Vietnam was because I saw us making very similar mistakes in what we did in Vietnam. But one of the things that you all have not talked about is the political side and the political mistakes that were made, and how important it is for the politics of the country to work in a positive way, and whether we should be involved in influencing that. And one of the things that happened in Iraq was that we were really flying blind in the very beginning politically. The only person on the CPA staff who understood anything about Iraq was Ambassador Crocker, and he was there only momentarily. And then if we go further and we look at what happened subsequently, when Ambassador Hill came out, we repeated very much the same situation that we had in the period earlier, where there was a lack of coordination and working together between the military and the civilian, and in which if the end game, which some of you have read, is correct, Ambassador Crockett decided that one of the things he wanted to do was Ambassador Hill decided one of the things he wanted to do was de-Crockerize the mission. What that meant was, instead of engaging the Iraqis up close and deeply involved, we would step back. Well, when you're working in a country like Iraq, you cannot afford to do that. You have to be deeply engaged with a whole series of actors in order to understand what's happening and then to try to influence it. And so that was one element that I thought was lacking in what you all were talking about, and I would like some comments on it.
Well, the political situation has been, as we read, every day about Iraq, extraordinarily difficult. And so let me take it from an Iraqi side, the politics of there. You know, to a certain extent, the post-surge, because I think we have two eras. I think I described it as from Firda Square to Nusra Square, and then from Nusra Square to regular order. And the biggest difference is our rate of spending. You know, last year we spent about $7 million a day. In 2005, we were spending $25 million a day. So to underscore General Odier's point, in this latter half, these latter 5 years, we've had limited leverage, or less leverage. Doesn't change. I don't argue with your point that it doesn't change the nature of the demands of what we should be doing. It just means the kind of engagement we have is less. I call it the Uncle Sugar effect early on. You know, we were giving them lots of stuff free, so to speak, that ran out soon. And concomitant or contemporaneous with that evaporation of aid was a complete political imbroglio in 2010, wherein Prime Minister Maliki came second in the ballot, and it pitched the country into political chaos for 9 months. Resolved that December in the Erbil agreement with 9 elements, depending who you're talking to, maybe 18, and none of which were adhered to. Mm-hmm. So the reality is that there has the efforts at reconciliation, which is the watchword for addressing the political imbroglios that have dominated Iraq and succeeded somewhat in the Sons of Iraq program, which was also not sustained after we stopped paying their salaries, have been lost substantially in the politics of Iraq. And indeed, all of what you see, I think, today, since last September's death sentence verdict of al-Hashimi, since the assault upon Raif al-Sawi in December and his forced resignation, since he's now hiding out, or as I should say, protected at Abu Risha's compound in Ramadi, now a place where the Iraqi army doesn't have purchase along with Kurdistan. This is the political context within which Iraq moves forward now in a country that is daily experiencing massive public protests about these political problems. But all of it is of a piece regarding Prime Minister Maliki's interest in a third term, which will be decided a year from now.
Maybe we could take a couple of questions that have more to do with the future, with lessons learned as they apply to current situations. So, you, sir, in the middle.
Thank you. My name's Warner Anderson. I'm a physician and anthropologist. I work in the Office of Secretary of Defense for Health Affairs. I'm the Director of International Health. And I'm a former Army colonel with 2 tours in Iraq. It seems to me that in the talk of stabilization and reconstruction, one theme that's been missing that's common between Iraq and Syria is the theme of sanctions, which arguably are the anti-stabilization, the destabilization, and the deconstruction of a country. And I'm wondering if in the equation of stabilization and reconstruction, if the effects of sanctions are taken into effect, if we're adequately taking those effects into consideration, and if there's an evidence base behind the application of sanctions so that we know that we're doing the right thing when we apply them. Thank you.
Just briefly on sanctions, short answer is yes, we are taking, on the Syria side. Syria is well sanctioned, as you know. It's very difficult actually to provide medical, you're probably familiar with this, medical assistance into the parts of Syria that the opposition controls because the country of Syria is sanctioned, and so you can't do that. So so the first thing we have to do is get waivers for people to provide that kind of assistance. So on the sanctions issue, you have to, right now we're trying to get around the sanctions that are in place in order to support the opposition. But the second thing we're doing, as we're preparing for Syria after Assad, we are giving a lot of thought to how quickly we can repeal the sanctions so that we can be able to provide the kind of assistance that we would like to do, probably not the reconstruction and stabilization assistance that we've been talking about here in Afghanistan and Iraq, but other kinds of support that we would like to be able to provide in response to their purchases, in response to their requests. It's that kind of thing. So the sanctions is a big component of our post-Assad planning.
Gentleman right down here. That's you. Yep. Sorry, I'm giving them a workout there.
It's good for the chaos.
Hi, I'm Rusty Barber. I'm a consultant here at USIP, and thanks for a wonderful panel that includes many former colleagues and people whose work I've admired very much over the years in Iraq and Afghanistan. My question builds off of, Bill, you said that we're not likely to find ourselves in one of these open-ended, large nation-building exercises anytime soon. And I pray that you're right about that. But John, if I understood you correctly, said perhaps not, but we ought to be prepared for something maybe short of that, if not on the scale we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan. And Stuart Bowen, you said that right now, as far as the QDDR is concerned, and the idea of creating some sort of coordinated response capability in the United States for the future, should we find ourselves in a similar kind of situation of having to doing stabilization operations. My question is, where are we with this? I mean, we still have these uncoordinated nodes, it seems. We have USAID with OTI, we have CSO at State Department, we have the defense doing its own thing, and so on. And my question is, what exactly do we need, and where are we with developing a more coordinated capacity so we don't find ourselves where we found ourselves in these two wars with a completely uncoordinated response?
Good question. Thanks, Rusty. Let me, a couple of premises. First of all, we don't get to pick where potential stabilization and reconstruction operations might unfold. How fragile and failing states devolve is a function of factors outside of our choices. We do get to pick how we prepare and how we respond. And those are also two different things. You know, we should prepare for a whole variety of responses, but our responses should be conservative. I think that's a lesson from Iraq and Afghanistan. I think that it is a statement of existentially obvious that we aren't going to do Iraq and Afghanistan again, you know, as well as a certain hope, you know, but it's not a policy. The right policy is to frankly have a capacity within the government, integrated institutional capacity that's preparing for the full spectrum of what might happen, so that the president who makes this decision can have at his option a variety of choices, rather than, as happened 10 years ago, when we decide to engage at whatever level, we hire a retired general for a short while and replace him with a retired ambassador for a not terribly long while, and go from 2 to 20 billion as we go from liberate and leave to occupy and rebuild in the blink of an eye. And that was tough to do because both the Organization for Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance and the Coalition Provisional Authority were, in Secretary Rumsfeld's terms, pickup teams. And I've called them adhocracies, acronymic adhocracies. I think, you know, that's just a descriptive term, not a particular criticism. It's just the reality of what happened, because there's no established capacity that's integrated. We have institutional or departmental capacities that I've outlined before, but how do they interweave in planning for the variety of potential outcomes that might unfold when a fragile or failing state gets worse and ultimately demands what should be, another lesson from Iraq and Afghanistan, a multilateral response. Do we have it now? No. Are we better off than we were 10 years ago? Yes. We have many, many more people, many in this room, hundreds, thousands outside of it, with experience in stabilization and reconstruction operations. That's an asset. Are they well organized? Do we know where they are, how we would use them? Not well enough by any stretch. Do we have improved contracting procedures? Yes. Are they uniform and perfected in the way that I've described? No. Do we have an IT system that would keep track of what we might be doing in a country in an interagency fashion? No. So these are all pieces that are in place, and it gets down to a military term. You know, I served in the Air Force, and You know, I had a primary duty as an intelligence officer, and I had an additional duty as a safety officer. You know, I paid all my attention to my work as an intelligence officer and did the safety officer work when I could. Well, there's no one with a primary duty now for planning for and ultimately executing and overseeing stabilization and reconstruction operations. You know, I think what Rick Barton's doing at CSO, as Bill Burns said, is good and making a difference in Syria now. But it's discrete, and it's contractor-shaped, and it's limited in resource. The demands upon us could be eventually much larger.
Well, that was an excellent summation in your question. I wonder if would each of the panelists like to comment more on that, or? And I also have a follow-up, which is, are we able to? Are we producing a generation of diplomats who will be able to know these areas they're going into? We've had several recent tragedies. I don't need to remind, and yet a man we've mentioned several times up here, Ambassador Ryan Crocker, had a career in the diplomatic service where when there was some sort of disturbance in Sabra and Shatila, he jumped in a car and drove down to find out what it was. That I haven't seen happening in any of the countries I've been working in. What are we doing about that?
Well, Rusty has a couple of good questions, but on that last one, you probably noticed, you should recall that Robert Ford, when there were disturbances around Syria, got in a car, drove out of Damascus, drove down there at some at serious physical risk to himself and the people that he was with, and in the end got kicked out of the country. But so the diplomats, at least if Robert Ford is an example, is one that we can point to that are still out there doing that kind of work. More broadly, Secretary Clinton, when she was the secretary, made a big deal of kind of expeditionary, transformational diplomacy. And that was get out. Now, it's hard. I mean, everybody here who's worked in Baghdad or in Kabul the last couple of years knows how hard it is to get out. And you've described the problems. Nonetheless, the recognition that that is important, also the recognition that we don't know enough. I mean, Robert Ford will be the first to tell you that we don't know enough about Syria at this point. We don't have a good sense. One quick thing on the CSO example, on Rusty's question, on the organization. This is difficult because in order to prepare ourselves for the next stabilization, reconstruction work, a large, and the proposal, Stuart, that you make is a large proposal. It would pull together all of the different pieces in the government that you have described. Some of those pieces that OTI, CSO, others have work in addition to an ongoing work at a fairly low level, right, while there is a low level of tension. And to build a very large structure is expensive. And just one example on that, and resources are tight, and that's the last thing you just said, Stuart, which you're exactly right. Resources are tight. Limited resources have constrained this. One of the programs that actually got up and running under CSO, under SCRS, when it was previously under John Herbst and before him Carlos Pascual, was the Civilian Response Corps. Mm-hmm. And so this was an idea that we would have, that the government would have ready to go. So that we didn't have to have this pickup game that you rightly described. Ready to go experts who could go in and do what Robert McGuire did and put together the electrical transmission system or the water system. We would have experts sitting ready to go. Well, these people, these experts, are in the government in many cases, not all, but in some cases. And their bosses, the bosses of these people, said, yeah, you can take this person, but what am I going to do when this guy leaves? He or she has got a job to do in the Department of Agriculture. So what the CSO ended up doing was paying those salaries. So the CSO paid the salaries for those people in the Civilian Response Corps who could be called at a moment's notice and to go do the kind of thing, so it's not a pickup game, just as you're describing, but it turned out to be so expensive for a long period of time when we didn't call on these people that the resources began to diminish. So we couldn't afford it, and we've changed. So there's some real world budget-constrained problems with a very large program.
And Bill, I think you're right, and then we're leaving that behind. That particular CRC is, as managed by SCRS, is done. It's over, and that's one of the reasons. There's a draft proposal, a bill in the appendix to this report, which is a little bit broader than what you suggested. I'm not suggesting, you know, capturing OTI, CSO, and bringing them all and making them part of USOCO with the U.S. Officer Contingency Operations, which is the proposal. I'm saying that there is a need to create an independent capacity for planning, execution, and oversight that would work with these other entities. Because as you rightly point out, OTI and CSO do similar work, very much OTI for aid, CSO for the bureaus, the other bureaus. And like in Honduras, which is not an SRO, but it's a need, right? And it's a discrete need that can be executed. There ought to be, though, you know, we could all name 5 countries that where an SRO might happen, you know, starting with Syria, you know, and Somalia probably right behind that, maybe Yemen. It's not hard to anticipate what's coming. Is there anybody planning for those operations now? And the answer is, outside of DOD and the kinetic components, no. You know, that it's not a mission for which we have an answer today. And I think, as John Herbst would tell you, you know, part of the challenge with SCRS was simply its placement within the bureaucracy. It didn't have the power it needed, even though its authorization statute eventually became law in 2009. You know, 4 years after its introduction. At that point, it had lost its impetus and momentum and was absorbed in the QDDR process. The QDDR, you know, I think has accomplished some important things, and I agree with the conceptual expansion. As I said to Rick Barton last week, hey, you're racking up more successes, you know, in these areas where we need success. That's good, but it's not the answer to this question. A problem I think we all agree on, which is we may be called upon again to engage in, maybe not in Iraq and Afghanistan, but something close to the Balkans, maybe, you know, several billion, not 60 billion, we hope ever again. But that still requires something much more substantial than either CSO or OTI could manage now. And so we would have to respond in a reactive way again. We'd be better for the reasons I articulated a minute ago. But rather than react, I say plan.
I think we've just got time for some closing remarks, unfortunately. I know there are still a lot of people who'd like to ask a question, but would anyone like to wrap up on that? I mean, it was an excellent question to close on.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the positive or silver lining is that within North Africa, and I think it's forced by resources, you are seeing stronger coordination between the agencies. Just as kind of the other side going in and looking, we're seeing more, you know, discussions more, and I think it is limited resources, which is forcing kind of information sharing. But there's always a very strong need to do it better, and I think that's true of the international community as a whole. And I haven't seen any system that works, whether it's the UN cluster system, whether it's the interagencies, you know, whatever it is, I think it will continue to be a challenge to really be able to coordinate and avoid any type of duplication, because the resources for the back structure are going to be hard. That said, because, I mean, the unpredictability of the region in itself is predictable. And so I think that there are certain areas where we can identify and start the planning process through broad-based consultations that I think that would then position us to be able to, I mean, very much what Stuart has already said, be in a position that we're proactive, or we're supporting institutions, we're identifying partners, that even when we do shift into a reactive mode, because I think that will always be the position that we're in, we have enough of an analysis and base information to be able to work from.
I would just add, I suppose, one small comment, that having just left a posting in Afghanistan, and I guess the tenor of this conversation being, well, lessons learned from Iraq, but we've sort of included Afghanistan as if that's something that's closed. And the Afghan friends who I worked with and lived with over 10 years of covering that conflict are very confused right now. Their story isn't over, as far as they're concerned. These lessons need to be applied there now, they would say. And they're very curious, and I think even this discussion here would be something that they would call the sort of the dissonance that they get every time they try to discern the American policy there. So probably it's too late for comment on that, but I just wanted to throw that out there as something that that is still an open question.
That would be a great next session for USIP to host.
Thank you all very much for coming. Thanks very much to our panelists, and thanks to USIP.